Imagine a classroom where every difficult idea is softened, every hard story smoothed over, and every uncomfortable truth edited for comfort. Imagine the students leaving that room, safe in the short term, but with fewer habits for wrestling with truth, fewer tools for moral courage, and a smaller appetite for mystery. What we are watching in pockets and in policy is not only a crisis of curriculum, funding, or test scores, it is, in important ways, a crisis of formation, a spiritual problem, wearing the clothes of educational policy. If schools are forming citizens, what kind of souls are they forming? Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast where we confront the deeper questions beneath our personal struggles and collective crises. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong. I am not a theologian or a philosopher, or at least by training. I am a PhD exercise physiologist with an interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. In this episode, we will explore the state of education in the United States, what is going wrong, what is right, and what it might look like to orient schooling toward human flourishing rather than mere safety, efficiency, or credentialing. Let's begin by naming the pattern. There are, I think, three things you can see if you pay attention in modern schools: increasing emphasis on emotional safety and the avoidance of discomfort, a narrowing of cultural purposes toward measurable outcomes and job preparation, and a pervasive sense among young people of existential restlessness. The first two are easier to measure: policies, trigger warnings, complaint procedures, standardized curricula. The third shows up in clinic rooms, in counseling centers, and in the cultural language of a generation that speaks often of anxiety, loneliness, and a hunger for meaning. Lukianoff and Haidt, in the book Coddling the American Mind, call attention to what they identify as three untruths that have become common among campuses and in youth culture: that emotional discomfort is always harmful, that people must be protected from ideas that might cause pain, and that life is a zero-sum battle between the oppressed and the oppressors. Those ideas become a scaffolding for certain practices: editing syllabi, policing speech, prioritizing emotional safety over argument or complexity. This is safetyism, a cultural posture that elevates safety above all other goods. I want to be precise. Concern for students' well-being is essential. None of us wants to minimize trauma or ignore abuse. The question is proportion and formation. If curricular and pedagogical choices primarily aim to prevent emotional upset, what do the students miss? They miss the training of moral imagination, the capacity to hear a hard story without being reduced to bitterness or collapse, the capacity to learn with a range of views and revise one's mind in light of argument, the capacity to experience grief and confusion without losing the habit of reasoned reflection. Here's a simple example you may recognize. A teacher assigns a controversial essay to stimulate debate. A subset of students feel hurt and calls to administration seek removal of the material. The result can be a policy that avoids difficult books altogether. In other cases, a student posts an angry critique on social media. The school responds with formal discipline rather than restorative conversation. The default becomes avoidance or punishment rather than guided engagement. If schools are meant to form citizens, people who can live in common with others who disagree, then training for conflict, for argument, and for discomfort is not optional. It is formative. So how do we teach that? Lukianoff and Haidt argue for cognitive behavioral tools, reframing catastrophic thinking, learning to tolerate emotional discomfort, and building robust debate skills. Those are psychological and curricular fixes, but there's also a larger spiritual horizon that we must recover: the formation of purpose and wonder. That's where voices like Eric Goff and Cranley become helpful. Eric Goff's The Purpose of the Universe invites us to consider that learning, at its best, is an entry into meaning. It's not merely information transfer. Recent guest on this podcast, Cranley, in The Call of Wonder, encourages us to place wonder at the center of education. Wonder, he suggests, is not a diversion from the curriculum. It is a method. It opens students to questions that reach beyond immediate application and onto the ethical and metaphysical and the profound. This matters because wonder changes motivation. A child who is introduced to the wonder of planetary motion, to the awe of the night sky that contains billions of suns, suddenly sees why learning matters. The difference is not small. It is formative. Wonder invites humility, curiosity, and endurance. It creates an appetite for long learning, study as a vocation rather than a transaction. How do we change the system? We start small. If you are a teacher, begin a unit with a wonder moment. Bring an arresting image, a short video, a paradox, or a primary source that raises more questions than answers. Ask students to write down one thing that puzzles them, one thing that amazes them, and one question they would like to chase. If you are a parent, do the same at dinner. Replace "How was your day?" with "What surprised you?" or "What did you wonder about today?" These are tiny rituals that alter appetite. Let me bring in Malcolm Gladwell briefly, because he helps us reframe disadvantages. Gladwell's work, David and Goliath, Outliers, reminds us that what looks like a weakness can, under certain conditions, become a source of creativity and resilience. The classroom that insists on a smooth trajectory, perfect test scores, zero failure, may not produce learners who can adapt to real-world ambiguity. When we design schools that punish mistakes harshly, we teach students to avoid risk. Gladwell would suggest that the desirable difficulty, the manageable challenge, is often where learning deepens. So practical policy would prioritize low-stake failure as a training ground. Iterative projects, drafts with revision cycles, presentations where the grade is less important than the process, make failure visible and normalized. Tell stories of scientists whose first experiments failed, of artists whose early work was rough. Reframe classroom norms so that the central question becomes, what are we learning from this attempt, rather than did you succeed? This is a cultural shift and also a curricular one. Now let me widen the lens. Teilhard de Chardin, my favorite scientist theologian, introduces a cosmic hypothesis that I find most provocative and potentially helpful for education. The idea that evolution is not merely biological change, but a movement toward a greater consciousness, greater unity, what he called the omega point. Teilhard's language is theological and poetic, but the underlying intuition is useful. Human formation is not limited to skills and knowledge. It is part of an ongoing spiritual evolution. If you accept that idea, then schools are small ecosystems in which our species' capacities for empathy, reflection, and transcendence are cultivated. This is not about indoctrination into any particular faith. It is about cultivating capacities that make higher-order cooperation and meaning-making possible. Teilhard's ideas invite us to imagine education as participation in a larger telos, a movement toward connectedness and higher consciousness. Standardized testing measures certain skills. They miss whether students can hold paradox, repair relationships, practice humility, and register deep awe. Those capacities matter if we are to move toward a meaningful conception of human flourishing. How does that translate into practice? Consider ritual and rhythm. Most schools have schedules and bells. Imagine adding modestly and without dogma practices that cultivate presence. Brief morning reflections that invite students to notice one thing of beauty. Moments of silence before tests to orient attention. Cross-grade mentorship programs where older students model patient listening to younger ones. These are not religious rituals. They are practices of formation. They habituate interior capacities we often assume will emerge on their own, but often do not. I return to the SPIES framework that we've referenced in past episodes, our shorthand for approaching spiritual formation in secular settings. Remember, SPIES stands for spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social, an approach that honors interior life without collapsing to sectarianism. Spiritual pathways means creating opening for purpose and wonder. Intellectual inquiry means structuring genuine questions rather than rote memorization. Emotional suggests the inclusion of music, art, literature, and ritual as forms of knowing. It means attending to narrative, identity, and how students make sense of their lives. Let me give concrete classroom moves mapped to SPIES. Under the spiritual well-centeredness, Begin units with big questions. Frame history not as dates to memorize, but as human stories that prompt moral reflection. In science, include historical case studies on how ideas emerged, errors, resistance, and eventual insights. Invite local elders, artists, or workers to speak about how their commitments formed. These practices expose students to multiple pathways to meaning. Replace some assessments with inquiry projects. Ask students to pursue a question that matters to them, grounded in evidence and reflection. Teach them research as a form of ethical investigation, sourcing, listening, and distinguishing opinion from argument. Model intellectual humility by showing how experts revise strong claims when new evidence arrives. Integrate arts, music, movement, and service into regular schooling. There is growing research linking physical activity to cognitive function. But the purpose here is broader. Embodied practices shape habits of attention and communal participation. A classroom that creates a space for a student choir, a movement warm-up, or an outdoor observation walk is shaping more than bodies. It's shaping receptive minds. Every student carries a story about themselves. Part of education is helping them craft an identity that can withstand failure, surprise, moral complexity, and joy. Use journaling prompts that ask not just what students learned, but who they are becoming. Host reflection sessions at the end of projects where students answer, how did this change what you think about yourself? One practical classroom exercise I would recommend is what I would call wonder work projects. Over 4 weeks, students pick a phenomenon that amazes them, say an insect's life cycle, a neighborhood's history, the math behind a favorite video game. Each week, they bring evidence, a creative artifact, could be a drawing, short poem, an experiment, and a reflection on why it matters, a deep form of show and tell. The assessment is a portfolio judged on curiosity, method, evidence, and reflection, rather than a single right answer. This flips the grading toward formation. Now, to be frank, none of this will work without adults practicing humility. Teachers, administrators, and parents must resist the easy default of policing every emotional upset and idea, and instead learn restorative practices. When conflict arises, the question should be, how do we repair relationships and teach skills for future conflict? Not only who is to blame, restorative circles, mediated conversations, and coached apologies are not soft options. They are training for civic life. We must also name structural realities. Many schools are underfunded, teachers are overloaded, and inequality shapes student experience long before they step into the classroom. Purpose and wonder cannot blossom where hunger, trauma, and instability are the daily context. So while we advocate for curricular and pedagogical reorientation, we must also press for social policies that reduce poverty, support families, and make schools places of relative stability. Another tension worth naming is social media and the attention economy. Young people today experience a flattened time horizon, quick rewards, endless social comparison, and the constant pressure to curate identity. That environment feeds anxiety and often short-circuits the patient effort that learning requires. Schools need to teach attention as a craft, not merely content filters, but practices, slow reading, extended projects, and sustained silence. Train students' attention like you would train a muscle. Let me bring in Lukianoff and Haidt one more time. They're not opposed to care, but they caution that protecting children from every unpleasantness can create brittle souls. Cultivating resilience is not about forcing exposure to trauma. It's about graduated challenges, cognitive tools for reframing, and a culture where risk is normalized and supported. It is about moral courage and the ability to speak truth in love, to listen when offended, and to repair when harmed. Here is a practical program you could pilot at a school. A weekly courage workshop where students practice structured debate on contested but age-appropriate topics, coached in listening and argument. A wonder hour once a month where classes open to cross-disciplinary curiosity projects. A mentorship program pairing older and younger students to model problem solving. Short daily rituals. 2 minutes of centering breath before exams or a minute of gratitude sharing at the end of the day. These items are inexpensive and primarily cultural. Culture is slow, but it is powerful. I also want to underscore a point Malcolm Gladwell would make. Context matters. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds may lack resources, but they also develop adaptive skills that a gilded set of comforts cannot produce. The mistake is to romanticize hardship or to punish the privileged. Instead, cultivate environments where all students can practice adaptive, creative problem solving. The classroom should be a laboratory for resilience practiced with love. We are skirting a set of deeper questions here. What is the telos of education? Is it workforce development, test scores, civic competence, spiritual formation? The honest answer is that schools must do many things, but we should acknowledge that what is measured tends to get prioritized. If standardized testing dominates policy, schools will teach to test. If public conversation demands moral character, schools will invest in character formation. Part of the work of educators and citizens is to shape the public narrative about what schools are for. Teilhard's Omega Point is, at its grandest, an image of human life moving toward unity. Whether you read that metaphorically, theologically, or as an aspirational image, it invites us to think of education as participation in an upward trajectory of consciousness toward empathy, wisdom, and an imagination capable of seeing beyond the immediate interests. That kind of formation is not quantified easily, but it is vital. So, what can you do listening now? If you are a teacher, pick one of the SPIES dimensions and commit to it for a semester. If you are a parent, start the wonder question at home. If you are an administrator, pilot a courage workshop or a wonder hour. If you are a policymaker, fund arts, recess, and teacher professional development for socio-emotional learning that teaches skills for tolerating discomfort rather than eliminating it. And one small personal practice for all of us. Cultivate your own humility and curiosity. Read a book outside your field. Visit a museum with no agenda but to be amazed. Practice asking better questions, not just, what's the right answer? What if this is more complicated than I assumed? That posture, when modeled by adults, is contagious. Before we close, I want to touch on one more thing, story. Narrative is the medium by which we make sense of learning. A student who sees herself as someone who can learn through failure behaves differently than one who sees herself as already fixed or broken. Teachers and parents shape that story through language. Use stories of revision, persistence, and moral courage. Read biographies of scientists, artists, and ordinary people who found meaning through struggle. Story educates the imagination, and imagination is the engine of formation. We've considered psychological fixes and the cultural necessity of teaching resilience. We've reclaimed the role of wonder via the likes of Brian Cranley and Eric Goff, seeing curiosity as a vocation. We've used Malcolm Gladwell's insight to reframe disadvantages, and we placed education within a larger spiritual horizon via Teilhard's Omega Point. We've translated ideas into the SPIES model and offered practical moves for classrooms, home, and policy. So here's a compact list to take away and use. 1. Teach discomfort with structure, practice debate, restorative conversation, and graduated challenges. 2. Prioritize wonder. Begin units with questions that amaze and ask students to pursue curiosity projects. 3. Normalize revision. Build low-stakes failure into assessments so that students can learn iteration. 4. Build embodied learning. Include art, movement, and outdoor observation as part of cognition. 5. Shape story. Help students craft narratives with resilience, curiosity, and moral courage. 6. Practice adult modeling. Show humility, curiosity, and a willingness to be revised. If you try just one of those a week, ask a child or a student what amazed you this week. You might be surprised how quickly the climate of possibility shifts. Thank you for listening, and if you found this episode helpful, share it with a teacher or a parent. Remember, education is not merely instruction, it's formation. It is part of our slow work toward maturity, intellectual, moral, and yes, spiritual. Thanks for being part of this conversation. Be good to yourself, be good to others.